Very good afternoon, morning, evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to another edition of our live stream show and to our monthly supply chain update. It's part of our tradition every week to bring you the latest on what's happening across the automotive supply chain in the midst of the corona crisis and beyond. But each month we take a step back and we look a bit more at the data, at what's happening on the demand side, and critically take a more strategic outlook on some of the changes, trends, and developments that we're seeing across the automotive supply chain. And today we'll have a quite special show because we'll get some insight indeed looking at other shows as well. So welcome again. My name is Christopher Ludwig. I'm the editor-in-chief here at Ultima Media, and my pleasure to be hosting you again this week for this week's show. And we've got a really good one for you here. Let me just take you through a bit of introduction. So again, thanks to all of you for joining us, and thanks particularly as well to our partners for the live stream, our Festival Transformation, and our May Supply Chain Update. C&W Courier Network, an important premium freight and expediting logistics partner specialized in automotive, and Fract Logistics Solutions, which provides finished vehicle logistics, IT, and optimization software, which can be used from anywhere, which is pretty important at these times of remote work. For you today, which we're going to be covering a range of data and insight, as I alluded to. We're going to first hear from my colleague and our master of data, if you like, Daniel Harrison, automotive analyst for our business intelligence unit, Automotive from Ultima Media. For any of you who tuned in a couple of months ago for the first supply chain update we did in March, Daniel provided you then with his latest global vehicle demand forecast and outlook. We've got an update on those figures today, and we've also got a bit more data, if you like, on some key major markets and how the crisis is impacting them now and looking out 10 years ahead. So we're looking forward to hearing what Daniel has to say. And it's great as well to be joined by Peter Weiss, who's the executive partner for chief supply chain officers at Gartner. And Peter will be sharing with us some really great strategic insight on what a number of sectors have been doing in the supply chain in response to the crisis, but in terms as well of supply chain reliability, visibility, and S&OP processes. And of course, many of you will have known Peter from his career prior to joining Gartner at Chrysler, and of course later Fiat Chrysler, where he led logistics in North America and later EMEA, and is really, I'm not just saying because he's here, is really one of the most interesting operators and thinkers in the automotive supply chain space. So having the opportunity to compare and contrast sectors as well as what's happening in automotive is a great treat for us today. And as ever, we're very keen to have your comments, questions, criticisms, opposing thoughts, provocations. Send them throughout the presentations during the show. Put them in the question boxes in your control panel, and I'll do my best, of course, to get through as many as I can. And if we don't get it to the show, we'll get you answers afterwards. So there's our roundup, our running order as indicated. We'll be with you for about 80 minutes today, and we will have the recording available after the show, as well as Daniel's slides will be available for distribution. But before I bring Daniel on for data, let's do our weekly global tour of things that are happening across the world of automotive and automotive supply chain. We'll just touch briefly on some things happening in Asia. Obviously, continue to see developments in the Chinese market. We've talked already about the return to sales growth in April. Reports that there are a lot of incentives, obviously priming this, potentially some price cuts. You might see price wars as we've seen in China in recent years when sales declined. Also, some interesting reports about Volkswagen potentially making a purchase in the Chinese space to consolidate some of the market there. So I think although China has been in a relatively positive direction in the coming out of the crisis, I think there's still some shakeup to come in the Chinese market. And as we've pointed out before, China, of course, not immune to the wider supply chain disruptions, and particularly the rhetoric and escalation of tensions with the US is a worry. And we'll talk a little bit later, particularly as well about trends around decoupling from China or regional localization, other regions, and what that may mean for automotive. There's certainly a lot of talk about that when we go across the sector today. How much is happening? That's a different question. Japan has lifted its nationwide state of emergency. That should be good news for operators there as more of the economy opens up. Many plants have still stayed pretty at fairly low levels and shut, at least as much to do with the demand picture and lower exports as to do with the state of emergency. We know that Toyota has already reduced shifts, and others such as Subaru have been shut. But the obviously state of emergency lifting should point to the chance for at least the domestic market to start moving again. Korea still has been resilient. We've seen positive figures, but just interesting to note this week that a logistics center became the center of a small, well, by European North American standards, perhaps a smallish outbreak of coronavirus cases. So just underlying again, where the risks are as we reopen economies, and we'll talk about that as well in the automotive space, where we also see cases popping up in plants and warehouses. So again, Korea probably one of the best to contain it, but certainly not immune to it. India continues the restart. We saw plants in Pune opening up, and again, Maruti and Hyundai, which the largest, which had been open, but have had cases and have had some disruptions as a result of that. Not particularly uncommon, given that's the whole point. We're scanning and checking as many people as possible. So of course there's going to be some changes, some stops related to that, but we can see that happening in India. But particularly the sector, and we'll talk about that more with Daniel, I'm sure, is in a pretty dire state. There were no recorded sales of passenger vehicles in India in April, so far as the data is available, and the industry is still desperately hoping that there'll be some help from the government. Only so far some deferment of regulations, and of course, when we turn to the supply chain, we've seen a lot of disruption there from state border issues, which is easing a bit now, congestion, and of course, perhaps the biggest issue is the migrant labor moving across the country, and the difficulty that poses if you can't get the migrant labor to the plants or warehouses. A lot of the supply chains are at risk of shutting down. Here in Europe, we're in a continuing phase of reopening economies. That has been the case over the past couple of weeks, and that continues with more plants opening. Outlined a few which are set to open further this week, or more of their plants this week, with next week Nissan and a couple more plants in the UK, and Sunderland and Halewood. Only a couple of plants so far as our data shows which haven't restarted, at least in assembly yet, although I should add that all that assembly is at low levels. So still some Jaguar Land Rover plants, and still some SCA plants, for example. I've had reports over the past week that one of the issues for JLR, for example, was that even as of a week, 10 days ago, only about 60% of the suppliers across the UK and the EU were fully open, which of course was going to delay any ability to get going. That situation clearly improving, but that's been the kind of phase across the restart. You have to go slow if the suppliers can't open with you. We're also seeing again that pace of stop and start slow, whether that's supply chain issues, whether it's strikes or labor issues or regulatory, as we've seen with Renault. I think a more fundamental thing in Europe is the questions are really starting to be asked now, and will be asked much more closely in the coming weeks and months about the footprint and the underutilization of facilities, which was evident well before the crisis, clearly exacerbated now, and the couple of plants a couple of companies which are certainly making some decisions now, whether that's the Renault Nissan new strategy, Renault's cost cutting program. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks. But highly uncertain demand, even as the dealers open. We haven't particularly heard yet of surges in demand, but again, I'll leave more of Daniel to go into that. The UK, one of the later ones to now start reopening their dealerships as well, which of course is just as critical to getting the industry going, or if not more than getting the plants. They'll be able to open from next week. pretty big announcement yesterday from France as the first to unveil its incentive program, particularly targeting low emission and EVs. In the case of trading in an old diesel and buying an EV, you can get about 12,000 euros in total subsidies and incentives there. So could be a way to stir the market there. That's certainly what the government is hoping. There's programs also under discussion for the EU, and a big wait is for Germany to see what Germany might unveil and decide over the next month. But again, we'll hear from Daniel later about what impact incentives and scrappage schemes could have on the supply chain and on the markets. Our reports on the logistics side in Europe are that it's still difficult, but the disruption overall has and is improving and is less of a risk as perhaps suppliers themselves and the financial stability of suppliers. And in North America, again, the fits and starts, and in this show, especially if you tuned in a couple of weeks ago, we dedicated a whole show to Mexico. We thought we answered the questions then, not so much. The situation isn't entirely clear, although it has improved. Most have begun to restart and continue to restart, but we just have some news that the state of Puebla has delayed a clearance for some industries there on safety grounds, which could set back Volkswagen and Audi's plans to start next week, and of course many suppliers there as well. And I think regardless of the fact that Mexico can hopefully get going now, we've already seen car makers affected by the delay in production starts in Mexico, particularly out of the supply base. So Mercedes-Benz, which we talked about last week, Volvo, GM with some truck shifts which have been delayed, and of course also has had some issues on cases. But again, I think the role of Mexico in the stable launch and recovery of the North American supply chain is ever more clear, and it shows us just a bit more about how interconnected the supply chains are, which of course is no surprise to this audience, but nonetheless seems to have caught some OEMs perhaps off guard who tried to get out a little bit ahead of this. And I think, and again, it's kind of partly queuing up to Daniel there, which is interesting to see the reports out of the US where there may already be some low inventory runs of very profitable vehicles like pickups and certain SUVs. So in a market that is already badly damaged, not being able to necessarily produce or supply those most profitable vehicles is, needless to say, very strategic and important challenge for the car makers and supply chain to overcome. Also saw the bankruptcy this week of Hertz, which again just probably points to the wider challenges across the wider mobility industry, but also the fleet side and volume, how that will impact on the wider picture. So many kind of moving parts as ever to this. That sort of stops our short global tour. Because we have so much to hear from both of our panelists. I'm really keen to sort of start bringing them on. But before I do, I did want to engage you all before we hear Daniel's forecasts. I want to hear some of your forecasts, actually. So let's start with a question, just getting your outlook on global vehicle sales. So the question is, apologies. My screen froze there. What is your expectation for global vehicle sales for 2020 compared to last year? So do you see minimal decline? This is a global, please. So again, not just your region, but the global picture. Minimal decline globally, global decline up to 10%, up to 15%, to 20%, or 25% or more. So give us your view on how you see the global picture. Obviously, that takes into account that the likes of China and stuff are moving at a different pace to elsewhere. So I'm just going to give you another 10 seconds or so, as I can see the vote share is now well above 50, so just about to petering out. So let's show your view. And of course, interesting picture there. I think you're pretty close, pretty negative, understandably, but 41% see a decline of 41% or more, but about a good more than third of you also seeing a decline of 25% or more. While I have you on the on your forecasting ability. Let's test you up against Daniel. Just one more poll. So which market do you see having the most negative effect on sales volume from the coronavirus crisis? Will it be China? Will it be North America? Will it be the EU, UK? Will it be India? Or will it be Brazil? So your most negative outlook by these key regions or markets. So I'll just give you another couple of seconds to cast your vote. And right, let's close the poll. It's going to be pretty close, I can tell you that. And interesting results here, and I think interesting stuff for Daniel to chew over. Obviously, just about a third, well, exactly a third of you think is going to be Europe. Not far behind is North America at 29%. So pretty negative outlooks for these two major regions of the world. And with that and your views, thank you very much for sharing them. I would like to bring Daniel Harrison on now. Daniel is our automotive analyst, responsible for our forecasting and data across what we do here at Ultima Media, and author of a great number of reports, which hopefully many of you have seen already. Daniel, thank you very much for being here and joining me again on our virtual stage. I know you have some forecasts, which I'm not sure if they're going to make everybody terribly happy, but I think there's some interesting outlooks in comparison to what the audience just told us. So I'm going to hand it over to you there, Daniel, and take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. It'll be very interesting to see how my forecasts compare with those polls, but I'll try and fit it within that. Thank you very much.
Apologies, Daniel. I'm just making you the presenter now. That is entirely my fault. So
okay, can you see me now?
We can indeed.
In full screen, yes. Okay, so this is our update on the global automotive demand forecast. And as Chris alluded to, we made this presentation in March, but we've now updated it, obviously in line with the latest information. But also in terms of feedback from that presentation, that people wanted a little more focus on key national markets. So we're now going to present the 5 leading national markets. First of all, just to clarify some definitions here to avoid any confusion. So our volume figures refer to passenger cars as well as commercial vehicles combined. Obviously, there's quite different market dynamics with those two. We know that commercial vehicles are holding up somewhat better than passenger vehicles. So that might influence our overall outlook compared to what we just saw in the poll. In terms of terminology, BAU refers to business as usual, as if the coronavirus pandemic had not occurred. So what our previous forecasts were envisaging for 2020. So we forecast in 3 scenarios. So best case, the most optimistic base case, and worst case, the most pessimistic outlook. And in terms of the sort of factors we looked at, we obviously looked at the length of lockdowns, specifically relating to car dealerships, and the strictness of the lockdowns, because obviously that varies considerably between countries. For example, the lockdown in Japan, although it was a state of emergency, was not enforced by law, whereas in Italy it was an extremely strict lockdown on the movement of consumers. And we obviously look at recent sales data in terms of monthly volume figures coming out in early 2020 and projecting forwards from that what's likely to occur over the remaining year and subsequent period. We're obviously also looking at the macroeconomic outlook in terms of GDP projections by banks, other organizations. You know, we're almost certainly going to have a major global recession in certain key regions, specifically Europe, and there's massive job losses and the likely sort of government support that's occurred in response to that. And in terms of automotive specifically, we're already beginning to see specific stimulus, scrapper schemes, tax incentives, subsidies, etc. And as we've seen from France, it's very likely to be linked with low emission vehicles and electric vehicles, at least in Europe and China. But the number one question is, of course, will consumer demand bounce back? That's the sort of big unknown in all of this. So here's our global forecast outlook. Now, the demand drop that we're seeing in the best case is the orange line on the graph on the top left, and we're looking at volume drops of around 14 million units per year for 2020, which is a 15.4% drop from 2019 values. Now, there's a couple of things to notice about our forecast. Yes, we've done it in 3 different scenarios, but we've also shown how it's going to develop just beyond, not just beyond 2020, but the next 10 years. Now, this is not going to be a V-shaped recovery. This is going to extend well beyond that. Even in the best case scenario, we're looking at effects 4 or 5 years out. And what's most noticeable is in the base case, the most likely scenario, the orange, there's going to be a permanent structural downturn in volumes compared to what we were previously expecting. So we won't recover fully from that. And obviously that's even worse in the worst case scenario here. So the permanent adjustment to volumes. In terms of putting this in context, so that 15.4% drop globally for 2020 compares with the 8% fall after the financial crash of 2008-2009. So it's essentially twice as serious, but it's not only twice as deep, as we just explained, it's going to be prolonged, it's going to be deeper and more fundamental in terms of volume reduction. So the impact now is severe, with 2019 volumes not recovering until 2023. But people often ask, okay, but you're projecting growth over that 10-year forecast. Well, yes, that's because there are fundamentals at work here, such as huge population growth expected of 1 billion people extra by 2025 globally, and of course huge emerging market growth in China, India, Latin America and MEA. Now, of course, China's GDP has been historically 6 or 7% over the last few years, greatly reduced this year, of course, but we do expect that to bounce back. But of course, the outlook will vary from the global picture by country, as we will now illustrate. So as you can see, the countries such as Japan, Germany and China will be the least affected by the COVID pandemic, with Japan being one of the least affected, so 8% in the base case. And you can see the global average there with the blue of 15.4%. The US almost exactly around the average of around 16%, whereas the countries such as France, Italy, Spain, and especially the UK will be severely affected in Europe. So let's look at 5 of those in a little more detail, a little more depth as was requested. So China, for example. Now, this is the world's #1 automotive market. It's absolutely pivotal for exporters all around the world, of course, but also domestically for China itself. So in China's case, we're expecting a fall of 3.1 million units in the base case, which is a 12% drop from 2019. So a moderate fall, but still quite extended the effects over many years. Even though it's recovering, it's not recovering to where it should have been prior to the crisis. Now, we know that their lockdown was around 9 weeks, and that was obviously not across all of China, mainly in Wuhan and surrounding provinces. But now all of that is virtually reopened and functioning relatively as normal. Sales in February were down 79% and 43% down in March, but in April we actually saw a bounce back of plus 4.4% compared to the year earlier, which was better than expected. But noticeably, that was mostly commercial vehicle sales. In terms of growth drivers, we know that government support has been extended in terms of EV subsidies, which previously was going to be withdrawn. There's been lifts on the limits of the number of vehicle registrations, and a strong shift to online sales as well has been noted. In terms of headwinds, GDP is expected to be down 6.8% in Q1 and only 1.8% for the full year. As I was alluding to earlier, that China historically for the past 3 or 4 years has had 6 or 7% GDP growth per year. And we know that China is introducing stricter emissions regulations in the CAFC regulation for CO2 emissions, and China 6, which is similar to the Euro 6 regulations on particulates. So moving on quickly to the US, in this case, for the base case, we're expecting a fall of 2.07 million units, which is a 16.1% drop from 2019. Again, quite an extended and protracted recovery trajectory that we're expecting in this case. And the lockdown in the US averaged around 6 weeks, but clearly there was very strong variation across the US states. We know the political shenanigans that occurred there in terms of whether it's a federal matter or is it a local state matter. But that varied enormously. So only around 50% of states had what we deem to be a full lockdown. As a result, US sales were only down 38% in March and 50% in April, which reflects that variation across the US states. For growth drivers, we know, of course, the US government has a very strong stimulus program of 1.8 trillion. I think that's actually been increased recently. And specifically around 500 billion of that is allocated to businesses that are struggling, and Automotive will hopefully get a share of that pie. There's also been a strong shift towards SUVs and pickups, as Chris previously mentioned. In the US, they're categorized as commercial vehicles, which allow them still to be purchased as essential vehicles. So that's a positive sign. The US is also starting to talk about implementing a scrappage scheme, also known as cash for clunkers. And before that, there was the relaxation of the US CAFE emission standards. The effect of that essentially is keeps the price of new vehicles down compared to what they would be, which is good for volumes, of course. And we're likely to see, potential OEM marketing initiatives to drive sales. Headwinds are that there was a strong surge in vehicles coming off lease. The effect of that is that it floods the market, reduces used vehicle prices, making new vehicle prices relatively less attractive. The US GDP has sharply fallen, minus 4.8% in Q1 of 2020, and probably the most significant statistic is over 40 million Americans have lost their jobs since the pandemic. And in the US, what we're seeing is somewhat of a contrast to Europe in that there's more of a risk of the supply chain actually restricting production and demand within the US. So that's an interesting contrast with Europe. So moving on to Japan, the third largest vehicle market in the world. Here, as I mentioned earlier, they had a relatively mild lockdown. As a result, in the base case, we're looking at a fall of 0.23 million units, which is a drop of only 8% from 2019 volumes. But Japan has other issues, not least a relatively anemic GDP growth anyway. Their lockdown was 8 weeks. But the state of emergency was not enforced legally. Therefore, we expect demand falls will be relatively modest, as I said, of the 8% there. Even pre-crisis, sales were down 8.2% in March, 9.3% in Q1 of 2020, due to a previous sales tax increased in October 2019. In April 2020, during the crisis, sales took a much sharper decline, as you'd expect, of 29%. So therefore, overall sales were still down 13.9% in the first 4 months of 2020. Growth drivers in Japan are that emissions targets are actually leading to the more increased availability of hybrids and EVs on the market. Commuters are concerned about returning to public transport, so that potentially drives new vehicle sales. And OEMs are likely to initiate marketing strategies to stimulate sales. There's quite a lot of headwinds though in Japan. The increase in sales tax from 8% to 10% that I mentioned, and even pre-COVID, Japan's GDP growth was less than 1% and formally went into recession in Q1 with GDP falling 3.4% in that quarter. And a major sort of demand side issue is that up to 3 million jobs could be lost in Japan due to the COVID crisis. There's new emissions regulations that are being brought in, and on the sort of production and export side, Japan is a major exporter. So clearly, if other regions are not buying their vehicles, falling exports will also impact their own domestic economy and hit the ability of consumers in Japan to buy vehicles themselves. Moving on quickly to Germany, the fourth largest market in the world, the base case scenario is a drop of 360,000 units, which is 12% down from 2019. Just to briefly put that in context, across the EU in total, we're predicting a 19.4% drop, which is one of the most severely hit regions in terms of demand. Now for Germany, the lockdown was relatively short, 5 weeks, and there were early signs that Germany's R value, the reproduction value of the infectiousness of the disease value increased, but that's now stabilized. As a result of that relatively mild lockdown, vehicle sales fell only 38% in March and 61% in April. For growth drivers, in November 2019, Germany introduced purchase incentives for EVs and PHEVs of between 4,500 and 6,000 euros. And we know that OEMs are lobbying the German government for some kind of automotive industry stimulus, but this has been put back until at least June. We know, for example, that just yesterday, France announced an 8 billion package, as Chris referred to support the French automotive industry on the demand and the production side. So we fully expect Germany to have some similar package soon. And there's of course likely to be OEM marketing initiatives to stimulate sales, and commuters returning to public transport are likely to potentially drive vehicle sales too. Headwinds are that the German government is actually forecasting quite a significant GDP contraction of 6.3% for 2020, with a potential rebound of 5.2% in 2021, although the very latest forecasts actually look even more severe and pessimistic than that. Of course, the German automotive industry is being hit across the EU by the introduction of the CO2 emissions targets in 2020 being phased in. So that's going to impact the price of vehicles and hit demand. And of course, just like Japan, Germany is a very heavily export-driven economy, with automotive being the backbone of that. So recovery is inextricably linked with vehicle exports in Germany. Moving on quickly to the fifth largest market in the world, India. In the base case scenario, looking at a drop of 530,000 units, which is 20% down from 2019. So quite a severe drop there, one of the most severe in the world. As Chris alluded to, there was virtually no sales in April, so quite a severe impact there. The lockdown has been 9 weeks, when it's likely to be lifted, I think, at the end of May. However, some dealerships did open in mid-May. Due to the lockdown and transition from the Bharat Stage 4 to Bharat Stage 6 emissions, vehicle sales were already reportedly down 48% year on year. And in terms of growth drivers, India should be doing well. Their previous GDP growth of 5 to 7% and strong trend towards urbanization is leading to many more people living in cities and the modernization of the economy in the country. Their growing middle class, consumer class is driving a very strong shift and transition from basic sort of 2-wheeled vehicles to 3- and 4-wheeled vehicles. And we've detected a very strong increase in online digital sales channels as well. And of course, there's likely to be OEM marketing initiatives too. The headwinds are quite strong in India though, which is part of the reason we have such a pessimistic outlook there. The new regulations coming in on emissions and crash test standards are going to increase the cost of vehicles, hitting demand. GDP growth likely to fall in 2020, or rather to stall in 2020 from their previous highs of 5 to 7%. So that's going to really be quite a different environment to market vehicles in. There's been a trend towards shared mobility, which is undermining sales of new vehicles, especially in the larger cities. And India has also had specific problems with changing insurance norms, often requiring people to pay in advance for their premiums. And also there's been cautious lending from automotive finance companies in terms of tightening the requirements. So there are all restraints on demand there. So the conclusions of COVID-19 are quite severe. The effects are going to be pretty profound. There's likely to be business failure within the supply chain, causing potential disruption to production. For example, there's likely to be forced consolidation in the case of bailing out single source suppliers potentially. Peter Weiss, who will follow this presentation, will go into more detail about the supply chain risks in his presentation. And there's likely to be in the medium term more industry consolidation, some M&A activity, a number of reasons to improve financial resilience, reduce costs, mitigate supply chain risks, but to pool resources to make them essentially more resilient to these industry shocks. What we are seeing as a positive is a very strong uptake of electric vehicles, much faster than we were previously forecasting, and governments are using this crisis as an opportunity to implement stimulus programs to drive this shift to electrification of the automotive fleet. But the delay of other case technologies, so I'm thinking of connectivity, autonomous vehicles, and shared mobility specifically, are likely to be hit quite hard. Now, we know the sort of long run profit margins previously of automotive OEMs is around 6%, which is relatively low, and of course likely to be zero or in losses during 2020. Therefore, there's likely to be major cuts in investment in those longer term technologies, which are not yet getting a return on that investment. But there are also opportunities in this crisis. So there's likely to be moves to gain competitive advantage or strategic lead, for example, by acquiring specific companies with advanced technologies, which will be available at a bargain price. And China, emerging first out of this crisis, is also likely to be positioned quite well to see this as an opportunity to gain ground compared to its Western counterparts and competitors. So that's our presentation for today. This report, by the way, is a brief summary and overview of findings in our upcoming global demand forecast report, which will be available in the coming weeks. But thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand you back to Chris now. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Daniel. I mean, we've already had some questions coming through, and I think there's plenty more that we'll come back to on the after we hear from Peter, who I see has just joined us. So thank you very much, and welcome to our stage here, Peter. So I think it's a handoff from demand to supply, so inextricably linked here. As I mentioned, of course, Peter is as a executive partner for global supply chain officers at Gartner, and of course has long industry career in the automotive industry, but is not just here to talk about automotive today. So Peter, I am going to hand over the controls your way, which should be coming to you shortly.
And do you see this now? Thank you, Chris.
Yes, indeed, we can. So, Peter, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and welcome everybody to this show. It's my pleasure to talk to you about some of the best practices that we at Gartner saw during this crisis and are still seeing during this crisis, and then trying to make some connection to what does this mean and what could we learn in the automotive industry. So when we look into the world of COVID and this crisis and pandemic, you can see that we see first, a wave of the pandemic that eventually triggers what we heard before, an economic crisis, and also this triggers then a financial crisis out there. And how we structure this crisis is by the 3 R's. We look into how companies respond, how companies recover, and how companies work on the restoration of their business. And we at Gartner had started right at the beginning with roundtables to support our various clients out there. And I will share later on some of the polls and findings that we had between different functions and different industries. So with this here, let me start to go into the learnings that we see from some of the successful companies. Remember the 3 R's. First, respond. So some of the best companies out there, they are part of the top 25, which were just unveiled last week. They are typically working in global operations. And these companies sprang into action right from the get-go when they heard about the virus in China. They put their own employees and people first, and were actually supporting their Chinese employees with PPEs coming from Europe and coming from the US to make sure they can continue to do production. Mind you that these companies all deemed to be essential business, so therefore they needed to have continued production out there. Also, these companies had already pre-existing risk management plans, and their emergency response team set up their war rooms in the region, but also in all of the different headquarters to ensure that they are connected. And as point number 3, they were communicating within the company, they were communicating with their suppliers, and they were communicating with their customers out there. So they made sure that everybody understood where they are, because they wanted to continue, and they were continuing to supply their products. In addition with this, they focused immediately on their inventory of raw materials, inventory of their finished good, to ensure that they can send their goods to their clients out there and to their customers out there. They also then took the S&OP process, which typically has a monthly executive cycle, and moved it down to a weekly cycle, ensuring that everybody is informed and ensuring that everybody is aware where the direction is going and what needed to be focused on. And then they looked into keeping the lines running, whatever it took. One big tech company out there, knowing the restrictions that were put on air freights, for example, pre-booked some of the freighter space, knowing that they require it for the future. So this is one of the response, springing into action and being successful in doing this. The next topic that we saw here, and let me take this away, was on the recover side. So on the recover side, when the pandemic moved over to Europe and then to the US, these companies, best companies, took the learnings that they had from China and moved them already into their operations in the other regions. So they did not reinvent the wheel, but utilized what was proven and good and working. In addition to this, they started out with their own protective gear and with their own hand sanitizers, for example. They had some skill set in their own plants, and they created their own hand sanitizers. They set up a mask production or a face shield production to ensure their own employees are able to continue to work, and they utilize this across. In addition to this, they looked into improved visibility out there. So we talked before about visibility of inventory. They looked into improved visibility. Even some smaller companies, healthcare companies, created their own dashboards very quickly to understand better what the potential impact is utilizing the government statistics, and what would this mean to their own PPE supply and what they could do about it. Then, very important in all of this is agility and decision making of the local commanders on the ground. They were allowed to make decisions and did not have to go through the total delegation of authority to get approval for anything. They were able to make decisions out there, including, for example, working with local manufacturers, for example, to help them for a healthcare provider to help them with production of some local ventilators, for example. In addition to this here, other companies were looking into scenario planning. So while they are restarting their operations in Asia, in China, they did not know yet when the startup would happen in the other region, and they created scenarios that they put on the shelf. A big coffee company out there was looking into scenarios in 20% opening steps to understand on what would it mean to their supply chain to be ready. And then lastly, the importance was that their teams in all of these companies were very resilient, regardless of where they were working, from the people that had to run as essential inside their facilities that were continuing to run, to the people working at home. They were working together 24/7, and it didn't matter where they were located. And you will hear more about this when we look into what were some of the outcomes of this when we look into the polls. So this was the recover side. Then it comes to the restore. And I hope now I'm able to get the next slide going here. Hold on. Next. Here we go. Okay. On the restore side, some companies are looking into how do they take the learnings that they had from the different regions and make them permanently. As one company said, a big agricultural company, how could we take this energy? How could we take this fast agility that we have and make them permanent inside our operations going forward? The next for the restoration was the safe work standards, and safe work standards that are being institutionalized. We know that last week most of the automotive industry restarted, and we see some of the, here in North America, and we see some of the pictures that show on how during the assembly process workers are being segregated to ensure that they're not contracting from each other. But think about how this safe work, at least some of the safe work procedures can help in the flu season to reduce absenteeism and ensure the health of the associates. So also, in addition to this, the work home policies have proven to be still good and supportive for the essential operation. So what will this mean in the future? Do we need all the people in the offices? And here came some interesting discussions out too in some of the various industries. What will happen going forward? Then the next thing that we see with them is that they were continuing to look into their planning, and they were looking into how to be more proactive in demand sensing. So they took different indicators out there that they correlated, and out of this year looked into what would it do to their demand. And there are companies out there, even companies that are in the automotive industry, that were looking into their aftermarket demand and into their sensing technologies that they had there to bring it into their normal operations. Another company, big solar panel company, has machines coming from Italy and China, where repair and maintenance people and setup people could not come from those countries due to the travel restrictions. So they were looking into new technologies, VR, AR, guided from technicians on the other side, to make sure that their own technicians are able to operate those machines and be able to repair them. So this is probably something that will be here to stay as well. In addition to this, these companies are already right now looking into what would it mean now going forward with the second wave of COVID, but going forward with other crises out there. So they're continuing to focus on when they're out or somewhat out of their production, that means all of the facilities working, what are they doing in order to improve the risk management preparedness? And one of the things that many of the supply chain heads in the various industries are looking into is improving their visibility tools. What can be done more? What is there out there to give them real-time visibility on all their goods and finished products? And then this has to fit into a digital roadmap in order to be able to connect all the various digital signals out there. But this digital roadmap is just the base to get an understanding where we are. Then they are working on and have implemented in some cases already various analytical tools tools that are taking those and help them to do the demand sensing, help them to do some analysis out of this to make sure they have the proper production ready. But this only works if you have people that are able to operate this. So they are focusing also on the people development and getting people that have and employees that have digital dexterity to be able to utilize these analytics tools. So that are some of the learnings that we see with the best companies in other industries out there. Let me show you a good practice that I found here in the automotive industry, which was between ASEA, the automakers, and Klepper, the supplier organization in Europe, putting a code of conduct out there, making sure that everybody understands automotive is all linked together, and transparency and communication is key, as you can see here, as well as the safety of the associates and employees. Here is a poll of one of the executive roundtables that we have that showed what did the executives experience in terms of strengths and weaknesses during the COVID-19 crisis. And first and foremost, as I mentioned before, is employee resilience. As a strength that everybody work together, all hands on deck. And it seems in crisis, people are coming together. They moved quickly, they collaborated well, did not matter which time zone and which time of the day it was. Also, some of the existing business continuity planning was put to action and was good to have. When it then comes further, what didn't work so well, you can see the technology infrastructure. Having so many people working from home was something that nobody totally has prepared for. So there were quite some issues with bandwidth, but also quite some issues with the technologies in order to support this. And that's probably one of the learnings that you will see out there. The people will fortify their infrastructure to allow for more of this offsite work. Strengths also meeting customer needs. So some of these top 25 companies continued to work and continued or even fulfill all of their promises that they had to their customers. Then when it comes to decision making, you can see here various companies were struggling, and the best companies out of a study that we had last year publicized, a research that we publicized last year about the 2008-2009 Great Recession crisis. You can see best companies out there maintained the kind of intensity and allowed decision making to the commanders in field, to the smaller groups, and not having to allow to go through the whole delegation of authority process that we also know in the automotive industry. So that's part of what we saw in some of the polls. Let me continue on. What did employees expect the organizations when the offices reopen? What did they want? First and foremost, make the return to work date flexible. Allow them to continue to work home, specifically on the East and West Coast, where you have long commutes. They were able to continue to do their work. So why not continue to do this? And we have some interesting company out there that's looking into their offices, and for right now does a rotation. So 2 functions or departments come in for 2 days per week and then can work from home, so that the necessary interactions could be done on site, but ensuring with this too that not too many people populate their offices. Interestingly enough, they're looking also into their total office space and how much they really will require. As they had some growth forecasted, do they actually need the additional office space out there? Then you can see the standards provide hand sanitizers and then frequency of office cleaning, but also have a clear articulated office health and safety protocol. Think about people working in offices that require elevators, and how many are allowed to be in one ride. So these rules have to be clarified, and so on and so forth. So this is something that the employees require. Then this was a question to our finance roundtable, and here you can see that 74% of the companies plan to permanently shift to more remote work post-COVID. So this will be here to come. But then all of the tales of this year, how do you monitor your employees? How do you ensure that everybody is productive, not just in a crisis, but in the future, have to be dealt with. this is about then, in order to keep liquidity in the companies going, there has to be some cost reduction efforts. And when you look into those, this was a poll to understand what companies were doing. First and foremost, because it wasn't possible anyways, was the travel and entertainment. Secondly, any kind of offsites and leadership meetings out there. But then already importantly, look into the capital expenditure investments, looking into, and you can see here the comparison between 2 points in time, end of March to end of April. So you can see that companies are strongly thinking about even delaying some of the capital investments. And lastly, look into hiring freeze, what can be done in order to reduce the hiring. But then conversely, there's another poll out there that I don't have in the deck here that shows what would CFO do first and companies do first when they see light at the end of the tunnel, when they know where their business is going. Number one is going back to hiring people, making sure they have the right talent there. And number two is unfreezing the capital investments. This is just a high-level chart that shows that over 65% of the various departments out there in companies, you can see that everybody gets at least a 10%, if not more, SG&A cut, with this year a big impact in their way to operate. And here's an idea that we at Gartner developed out of this series. What can we do to help on a cost optimization roadmap for various supply chains? And in this year, you can see we don't call it cost reduction, because the one-time cost reduction shot can also hurt you. But we're looking into cost optimization. So the immediate one is clear. Look into where you are, look into your contracts, look into your terms and conditions. And we had several instances where we were able to work with our clients and showed them in some of their contracts that they did, for example, in the logistics world, that there could be some more standards put forth that allowed them for savings, for example, on bunker or, for example, on fuel surcharges. Also, we have tools out there that show how you can benchmark your current spend and your efficiency. So we have data sets out there that show you what can be done and how others compare to you. Then this allows you then to identify and prioritize the opportunity that you have, and look then as point number 4 on how you communicate this. How do you ensure that everybody is aware and you get buy-in from your executive team? But then last but not least, make sure you continue to think about what could be out there. What could be out there in terms of unforeseen scenarios, and what do you require in order to be agile and be able to respond to the next crisis that's out there. So this here is part of our roadmap that we can support various clients out there. And the risk landscape is evolving. So we have the various predictable risks that we see from financial, from labor practices, from safety that's out there. But we see already some new emerging risks coming, like cyber and data breach, and not just only to companies and headquarters, but also going right now after individual routers in their homes as people are working more at home. Cloud security, reputational risk out there with disgruntled employees that might take their frustration to social platforms. And then, of course, force majeure style pandemics or weather-related impacts, which brings me to the next one, that the next crisis is just around. The 2020 hurricane season, as we have heard from a big provider out there, are right in front of us. And when you look into their assessment, it shows that the forecast in the Atlantic will be above average in terms of wind strengths, and with this, of course, potential impact and disruptions in the supply chains out there. So additionally to this, as we are restarting 40+ assembly plants in North America, it's like Wall Street Journal said, putting a complex jigsaw puzzle together. And companies that started a little bit earlier got also hard-hit by the supply chain impact that like Mexico had, because it doesn't help that we have 3,499 parts ready and available in the assembly plant if this one part is missing. And lastly, crises are around. Here in Michigan, we saw the flooding in Midland where we have Dow Chemicals headquarters as well as facilities there that might have an impact on the supply chain out there. So you're never sure, and as we say in automotive or also in supply chain management, stay paranoid. So here we are. What is the impact of all of this, what I showed you for the automotive supply chain? First of all, the automotive industry pyramid is an ecosystem that can only function if all the various parts are together and if all the parts 100% are there to produce the final product. For 2020, we heard before Daniel talking about that our demand will go down, and with this production will be reduced by about 16% globally. As we are restarting the plants globally, there will be a strong impact on the local regulations, but also there could be a resurgence of COVID in the fall, and companies have to be prepared for this. On the customer demand side, it might be that the current demand that we saw out there and that we saw in the releases to the supply base down to the tiers in the past might change because customer demand might be changing out there, and tier 2s and below might see a bullwhip effect of 1 week they see a big demand, the next week it might be gone, and they should be aware of what this means. On the consolidation side, as we are hearing out there, there are per day between 5 to 7 bankruptcies of smaller tier automotive suppliers out there. What will this mean? This financial distress could impact consolidation, but also as we are going forward, various suppliers are relooking their supply chain in terms of reshoring and multi-sourcing, and this will play a role in the way on how the business will be run going forward. On cost optimization, the pressure is there. Liquidity is important, and so there probably all of the companies out there and listeners on this call are working on the one or other cost reduction effort. On the demand forecast side, we talked about demand, best companies doing demand sensing. So this can also play well in the automotive supply chain world. It's just a question on how do you utilize and what kind of signals do you use. One example, a big tier supplier in the automotive world that also does good aftermarket business is utilizing the tools from there to implement them into their sensing for the OEM business. Communication, important. We saw the ASEA-CLEPA code of conduct, and it is important that we continue to ensure transparency and communication between all parties, because that's the only way on how we can ensure that the plants are not only restarting, but continue to gear up, get the shifts going, and continue to deliver to the demand out there. The S&OP process is in my mind the engine of any operation, and with this year the increased frequency of S&OP processes needs to be taken in account in order to ensure that you're ready and agile to the various disruptions out there, but also scenario planning need to be in there and need to be brought to the executives to ensure that everybody is aligned. Lessons learned, they should be translated into the new realities of doing business, and they're actually invigorating many of the employees, because typically it's faster and it's more productive and avoids much bureaucracy. Business continuity plans need to be established and they need to be prepared, because the next crisis is just around the corner. And how do you do it? By utilizing visibility tools and looking into your digital roadmap and your digitalization projects to ensure you get the full visibility on your roadmap, on your material supply, and on your finished good supply to your clients. As Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And as we know, in supply chain, number one, stay paranoid. Keep the eye on the ball here, making sure you're not thinking you're already out there, because the next crisis is just around the corner. With this, I can offer you support that we have. We have a free of charge web access to some of our research for pandemic planning. that also has access to some of the roundtables that we have, as well as to some of our cost optimization tools out there. And that's something that I would offer up to you to have a look into. With this here, I'm done with my presentation. Thank you, and back to you, Chris.
Hey, thank you very much, Peter. So who knew that we'd have two forecasters on the show, one forecasting the demand, the other one forecasting hurricanes, just in time, I think, for there. But indeed, thanks very much, Peter. I think that was a great overview of what other sectors are looking at across the supply chain, hitting on some really key points there in terms of what we need to see happen in the supply chain, in terms of potential, systems, investments, visibility, S&OP, scenario planning, all of these, I think, really critical parts. And I think we can come on to whether or not we're really fit for purpose and ready for that in automotive. We're going to bring Daniel back into the picture. Whilst Daniel's coming back, let's ask the audience another kind of question. Now that we've just heard about some of the strategic supply chain approaches, maybe we can get the audience's opinion on what where the automotive sector supply chain might be, might have some weaknesses in terms of its own processes. So if you can give us a sense of what you think, what's the biggest weakness in automotive supply chain? Is it single supplier location sourcing? Is it supply chain visibility? Is it forecasting, demand planning? Is it supplier relations, or is it around people and skills? And of course, there are other strengths and weaknesses we could have listed here, but we're limited. But just to kind of get a little bit of the sense here. So I'm going to give you another 10-15 seconds as you vote. It's not as runaway as I might have thought as a result. It's starting to even out a little bit. And as I let the audience finish up their vote, the question that I want to actually first put to Peter is actually on the S&OP side, because he's identified that as the heart and engine. So I'm gonna, once I show the results here, I want to get your opinion on something, Peter. But hold on, let me just share this because it's interesting, and then we can dig in. So the results are in, and maybe not surprising given the circumstances we're in at this moment, and all that. And Peter alluded to that in terms of the supply communications and the difficulties around forecasting and demand planning. 38% of you think that is the weakest element. It's sort of a split after that between the single sourcing aspect, fragility in supply chains from that, and supply chain visibility. So that's sort of snapshot of what our audience thinks. Peter, when you talk about S&OP as the engine of the supply chain, and you obviously have plenty of experience in automotive, broadly speaking, is the automotive industry effective at S&OP, and and does it have other benchmarks it should be looking towards, and perhaps are there places in automotive where it's particularly stronger than others?
I would say that the high-tech industry is the example of where they're utilizing all different factors that they're putting into the S&OP models on the demand sensing side to understand what's going on out there. And they're also putting resources in the ability to flex with what the markets and competitors are doing. So I think they are the example that can be looked into all the way down, if you want, to a big online retailer that starts with an A, that has over 250 plus data scientists that are creating models out there that have, besides the business plan, all the various factors in there, and they actually are not even predicting but prescribing to their category leads what they have to do. So there's something that can be learned, and it has to be translated into the different tiers that we have in the automotive industry.
And particularly challenging and relevant now as we go through this unprecedented restart. Daniel, a couple of questions have come around this, so I'm going to actually one that just came in, which sort of sums it up, which is sort of kind of asking about if there's a 15% global demand reduction this year, would we not actually need quite a sharp rebound in Q3 and Q4, which would actually look a bit more like a V? So the question is actually that, is that outlook perhaps surprisingly optimistic in some people's view, given I think the 8 to 10 weeks of lost production and demand that we see in some markets. Do you want to just touch a bit on that? I know it's that's a global view as opposed to a regional view, but yeah, that's the question there.
Yeah, I think that's a common question that comes up, and yes, one of our sort of core assumptions is that there will be some kind of rebound or bounce back or bullwhip effect, largely driven by that pent-up demand that's been lost in March, April, May, combined with various stimulus programs or incentive schemes being introduced. For example, France is one of the first to announce that, but we expect that within Germany, China and the US, at least, the key automotive markets. So yes, we do expect quite a significant bounce back, but I think it will be a short-lived one. It won't continue into 2021, where we expect, as we showed in our forecast, overall volumes to be down again. So yes, there will be a short blip to where that sort of pent-up demand unwinds. Those subsidy schemes are unlikely to remain in place forever. They're likely to be short-lived because they're very expensive for governments to finance. So it's debatable how long they will last, whether it's 6 months, a year, remains to be seen, of course.
And I suppose one of the things that's worth pointing out too is that your assumptions are not based on a second wave, at least in the major markets, because I think a second wave would put a lot of things into question. But do you want to address that a little bit as to what it's not necessarily a comment on the disease so much as the response, I think, in terms of what your forecast is showing there?
Yeah, that's right. I think our sort of analysis is that there's unlikely to be a second lockdown. Let's assume there is a second wave or an increase of cases after restrictions are lifted. I personally believe that governments around the world will find it untenable to introduce a second lockdown. The general population will probably react quite negatively towards that. So politically and economically, in terms of the damage that's being done to the economy, I find it very unlikely that governments are going to lock down. I think in the UK, they've just announced that if there are peaks, it's going to be very locally locked down. Nothing like the sort of national lockdowns we've seen across Europe and most other regions in the world.
It's an interesting point, and I wanted to kind of segue that slightly to, when we talk about, I mean, and I'm starting to wonder if post-COVID is a relevant term, if we're, we're in and with COVID, and that is the kind of reality, right? And so we know the operational standards are changing. Peter, you showed the ASEA CLEPA handbook. Obviously, there's others which are being developed as well. First for you, Daniel, from an economic point of view, and then Peter from maybe a supply chain point of view, does this aspect of the new normal kind of constrain our business models in a more substantial, permanent way? So in the sense that, Daniel, from does that take away demand over the long term or medium term in terms of the restrictions that we have to kind of deal with, social distancing, you all know them. From a supply chain point of view, does it kind of limit our efficiency and operational ability to work in the same ways that we did before? So, two different questions, but from the same subject. Maybe I'll start with Daniel.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think from a demand perspective, does social distancing prevent people from purchasing vehicles? That's an interesting question. I mean, car dealerships are going to be allowed to be open. They're relatively spacious organizations. They don't need to be crowded with people to make vehicle sales. So I don't see that as a major factor restraining demand. I think that the much bigger picture is consumer confidence. Post crisis, are they going to be willing and able to purchase a big ticket item like a vehicle? In my mind, that's a big question, especially given the levels of unemployment and government debt that's been accumulated right now, in terms of, ultimately all of us are going to have to pay for that through higher taxes ultimately. So that's going to hit consumer demand inevitably.
And Peter, in terms from almost like, a supply chain planning operations side of it, do you see these sort of new practices as more significant constraints, or more like adjustments to that we can get through?
I would say first it's like adjustments, and I would take and lend some examples companies that are essential business, all the way down to the grocery store. The supply chains found a way on how to handle it. Yes, they had in between stops and goes, but nevertheless, overall, they continued to work. And those practices maybe stay and will be longer around than before, actually even helping on a potential flu season timing out there. So in my mind, it will have an impact. In terms of density of freight and other things, probably not. But in terms of labor practices and social distancing and the way on how you bring shifts in, yes, for sure. So I think that's what we will experience, that will continue on, and that might be foreseen as a potential good practice for the future when we have ways on how to combat COVID, when we have vaccinations and we don't see this outbreak anymore. But still, some of those best practices might stay.
And kind of on that point of the stop-start, which you know, you alluded to in the other industries, and obviously we've been talking about them a lot each week here, and you alluded to a few in your presentation. Do we make too much of it? Do we sort of, you know, it's front page news almost now when the plant is stopped for a bit? Certainly, we're paying close attention. Is it, you know, is it something that has become a bit mediatized to a certain extent compared to what the normal practice is, or are these genuinely, you know, kind of supply chain constraints and challenges that pose a pretty big threat, at least in the short to medium term?
If you look at the companies that are deemed essential and that continued operations, they also had cases of COVID within their employees, but they found mechanisms and ways on how to quarantine, how to sanitize the areas, and then continue with operations. And I think that will be the new norm here also for the automotive industry. So I think we're making a little bit more out of it, which is probably a process and procedure that has been very well documented also in various safe work handbooks that the automotive industry has available. So you just follow the process and it can be done.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. Thank you. So turning to another question from the audience, we have quite a few here. Let's do. Okay, this one maybe is a tough one, but maybe Peter, at least from your perspective in North America, you might want to take a crack at it. As it appears, the Mexico response similar to the US is a state-by-state decision. Any idea on how long it's going to be affecting us? So, I mean, I guess anyone's guess is good here, but I guess just the point, yeah.
I think that it's a guessing game here. I assume that all companies have enough pressures on the governments to reopen and to be able to get production going again, and with this get the liquidity of their companies going. I think it's a matter of how are they able to put the appropriate local health and safety requirements in place, and how much are they able to convince their employees to come back to work. As we heard the latest one with the maquiladoras on the border to the US, there are many employees that are afraid to come to work, and we experienced this. I also have the example of a manufacturer here in the US as an essential business that put such tight safety protocols in place, which are similar to what the automotive safety protocols that have been published are, where employees actually said they feel more safe coming to work than going to the grocery store or other things. So they actually felt good about it. And the essential companies have started right from the get-go to continue operation to monitor their employees as well. And the ones I talked to didn't have any flare-up of any additional COVID cases, as people are very careful. I mean, when they do this, people have a self-responsibility, and they seem to be good in doing it.
We have this is a theme that comes up a lot in our shows and discussions, talking about regionalization, localization of the supply chain. Peter, you addressed that. Danny, you sort of referred to it as well, and some forced consolidation aspects which might change. You know, Peter, again, from your point of view, both looking at other industries as well as obviously the time in automotive, these sort of supplier sourcing and decisions are pretty complex, and a lot goes into them, not something you just switch overnight. Do you see a shift likely or more investment likely into this as a strategy for more robust or other changes around it? What's your sort of view so far?
I think it depends on the risk tolerance that companies have, and that's every company has to make their own decision where it is. I can tell you high-tech companies that I have seen and I have talked to, and they're part of our top 25. They have looked into this and they made deliberate decision in their purchasing contracts to ensure that business continuity planning is part of the contract and it's being exercised not just this first year, but all the way down. And they're doing actually drills to ensure that everybody is ready for this. So this is not by happenstance that they're able to continue to work within their whole supply chain during such crisis. But they made deliberate decisions. They made deliberate decisions on multi-sourcing. They made deliberate decisions on reshoring in order to ensure that they're ready to operate in a crisis mode.
Daniel, maybe I know we're running close to the end of time, but there's a few questions we'll try and pick off whilst we're here. Daniel, I have a question here just to kind of confirm some of your data sources, and I thought, I mean, I certainly know what they are, but I think if anyone in the audience, you know, is wondering, obviously you do build these forecasts yourself, but do you want to just emphasize where how you build these, what you built this forecast from, what the inputs are?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So the base year or historical sort of data is derived from OICA published data, which is publicly available. And in terms of the annual figures that come out, or rather monthly figures that come out, they're also publicly available, for example, from ACEA and all of the regional organizations. So in terms of the forecasting, so what I do is I use a multitude of, I look at all of the range of forecasts out there, and I use my own judgment as to where I think the market's heading based upon the news events that come out, the other data sources that I can find. So it's a very multivariate and wide-ranging analysis based on a huge range of different sources. So I come up with my own figure. Now, of course, people will differ. You know, people often question, okay, 15% or is it 20%? So I'm basing that on a set of assumptions, and when people produce different forecasts, it's not that they're different, it's just that they're using a different set of assumptions. For example, they may think there'll be no government stimulus programs, or the lockdown will be reintroduced, we'll have a W wave recovery, or you know, such like. So it's not that the forecasts are different, it's that there's different assumptions and inputs that go into that. But one of the key ones that I always input is that, you know, whatever happens with COVID, the longer term fundamentals are still going to be there. For example, population growth, rising living standards in emerging markets, that's going to dwarf this relatively short blip, and overall volumes will still rise by 2025, 2030 as a result, despite this crisis, which is going to be severe. So those are the sort of range of inputs that I'm factoring into all of this. But I think it's also good to examine GDP forecasts, you know, globally, and in Europe is going to be quite severe. So I'm using that full range of fiscal indicators, industry specific indicators, and, you know, pulling that all together to produce my overall assessment of where the market's heading.
Peter, for you and not your other guests there, but just kind of turning that a little bit into again the points around the demand sensing and all the tools which are potentially available in terms of data analytics and feeding in on this. You know, again, looking at the automotive industry, we talk about high tech is doing it really well. Does the kind of complexity of the automotive industry, which is arguably many of those supply chains combined, you know, into multi-layers from the electronics to industrials and stuff, is it the complexity of it that limits the ability to really use those tools to the full extent, or in fact, is it the sort of a lack in investment and a focus on them as such?
I think if you look at the pure automotive business as the OEM production business, you could say there's only a limited amount available against a free market where you have end customers that you're servicing. Many of our tier ones, many of our tier twos have other businesses out there too, and they're actually going in the aftermarket towards the final customers or dealers out there. So I think overall it behooves anybody to look into the way on how they are doing their forecasting process, the demand process, and then be able to transfer some of this into their normal OEM business as well, and making sure that also analytics tools are being applied so that they have the best possible prediction that they can utilize for their own production needs. Not too much different than many of the other pure consumer companies out there. So I think very important, as I mentioned, is visibility to give you the right signals out there, but then also make correlation that give you a good input, and then have your analytics model that allow you to do some predictions out there. And yes, I think we can learn from other industries in automotive, and we are not there yet.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the last question around that there is automotive, you know, we talk about ROIs, and you know from your days, ROIs in the 6 to 9 month span. I'm not sure that will stretch out too much now that we're in such a tough demand situation. So has it been also, you know, a focus away from strategic investment and more on piece price costs and operational costs? Because obviously in automotive, the investment, as Daniel's alluded to, margins are low, high investment needed elsewhere. This is just supply chain's just been less of a focus.
For sure, this was a driving force, lowest piece price. But I think more modern company, including automotive company and OEMs, are looking into supply chain more holistic now, and into the models of plan, source, make, deliver. That is the base on various models out there, and see on how these things all play together. So good companies are utilizing this as a base, and then look into a total optimum, including their risk and business continuity appetites that they have. So all this together will tell them what they have to invest. But for sure, it's time right now to invest into these tools. Also, as we are seeing that some of those companies are playing around on how they can go into digital commerce with final customers, these tools are all required in order to support this. So I think these two forces will drive the automotive industry also to go more deep into a digital roadmap and into analytics. And then it will require different kind of people that are able to handle this.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I appreciate the input from you, Peter and Daniel. There are other questions here, but I realize that, you know, we're kind of gone above some of the time that I've taken from you, but I think it's been very much worth it on behalf of our audience to get that. We'll field a few more of the questions that came through, and make sure that there are some answers that we can get out there, either through another recording or something that we write. And of course, as Daniel alluded to, we'll have an updated report coming out in, you know, soon that will include more. And Peter, looking forward to keeping up and following up with more of your insights,
sure,
you know, over the course of this show and other things that we do. So thanks both to very much to both of our guests. I just want to, you know, give you guys a little sneak preview of some of the stuff coming up for us over the next couple of weeks, as I share my screen with you. Sorry, thank you. So, you know, once again, firstly, thanks again to our partners for the supply chain update, live stream, and what we're calling our Automotive Festival Transformation, which we continue have already moved through the last couple of weeks and continue ahead in this spring, building up to further events coming up over the summer too. This month, we've got a lot more in store. You know, some of the questions that were coming through in the audience were around port, you know, managing inventory at ports, managing throughput as Mexico comes back, as inventory drains in certain models. So, you know, in terms of the finished vehicle supply chain and logistics, tune in next week. We've got a specific focus on some issues there as we restart the network. We've got some great guests already lined up, including from Volkswagen and from Glovis. So we'll have a lot of great discussion next week. We'll also be looking out in the month. We're looking at more digital tech and innovation, kind of specific tools, if you like, that are supporting the recovery phases in line with what Peter discussed and other areas of production and logistics. We'll turn a bit more focus as well to Europe later in the month, kind of assessing the situation more broadly here in specifics, and indeed we'll have another supply chain update with some data inputs for you at the end of the month. And that's not it. That's not the only thing we're doing, and there's more to come in July. And we'll be sharing more of those details with you. Next, again, thanks to the partner CNW, Courier Network, who's our supporter and partner. Fract Logistics Solutions, and from next month, as part of the June program, Proact International will also be a key supporter. That's an important IT company in the finished vehicle space, and we'll hear more about some of their insights next week. As ever, get in touch with us with ideas, comments, questions. The show is produced by my team and myself, Nimish Ladwa, Richard Logan, Victoria Johns, plenty of others behind the scene as well, but we're very keen to hear from you from an editorial point of view, from guests and other topics. Let us know your thoughts, and we'll continue to cover them here as much as we can, including correcting us. Some of you may not hear I was nicely corrected early in the show about Honda Swindon, which indeed has delayed its production start in the UK until June 8th. So I'll fix that on the slide. But I love when I get corrected, as often happens and should indeed happen. So thanks very much again to our guests. Thank you to all of you for your time and your questions. We look forward to seeing you next week and throughout our program in the Festival of Transformation. Thanks again to Peter, and thank you, Daniel, and everyone. Enjoy the rest of the week, and hope you have a nice sunny weekend.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.